Hello, welcome back to the Human Rights Defender podcast. My name is Philip Merrill, and in this episode, I'll have the honour to be speaking with UN Special Rapporteur on the situation for human rights defenders, Mary Lawlor, perhaps the most relevant interviewee we could have hosted on the show, and I'll just allow her background and her experience to really drive this point home. First as an activist, later leading Amnesty in her native island. In 2001, she founded and managed Frontline Defenders, and as of this year, she heads an office at the UN, which is in communication with hundreds of human rights defenders from right across the world. Really someone that has worked with and worked on HRDs at the highest international level, but also regionally with national institutions and very much also on the ground. So much to get through. Let's get straight into it. Mary, thank you so much for finding the time to speak to us. We actually started this podcast this spring, so roughly around the same time that you took up your position at the UN. And of course, it's been a period in which COVID has quite simply dominated every or almost every part of our lives. So even speaking with human rights defenders on this show, quite often our very first question would be somehow related to COVID, or more specifically the responses or measures introduced by governments, which, as we know, were quite often disproportionate or restrictive. What's the view from where you're sitting? How has the pandemic impacted human rights defenders globally?
When it comes to COVID, obviously all states have taken action in response to the spread of the virus. And I certainly think that human rights defenders should have been approached by governments to help them combat the pandemic, because they could have been involved in sharing information about hygiene measures or provided input into what might mitigate some of the side effects. And instead they were, to be honest, they were criminalized. I mean, we've seen it in every continent, practically, well, probably every continent, but I'll give you a few examples. There was the death threats to Ruth Mumbi in Kenya because she spoke out against forced evictions during the pandemic, even though the government had said that there would be no forced evictions. There was also Nelly Versinas from Chad, and there was a plan to abduct him, and he had to go into hiding after speaking out about electricity outages at a time when people were confined to their house. And another defender, Gamuchirari Kara from Zimbabwe, he was violently arrested and charged with subversion for distributing PPA. And of course, Nurkan Baysak, she was a journalist. And we've seen this with many examples of journalists all around, was accused of inciting the public to hatred on the basis of posts on Twitter about the COVID outbreak in Djibouti. And then what I found very interesting was all the new defenders that emerged during the pandemic, notably medics, but they were also targeted by their community. Many of them were fired from their jobs and others were arrested. We've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in Nicaragua, we've seen it also in Turkey. And then when we get to just the day-to-day living of human rights defenders as they try and carry out their work, many of them got COVID and many of them had felt like they were sitting targets because they couldn't move to places of safety if they were targeted. And also generally for security purposes, as you know, defenders at risk often arrange to move in groups rather than alone. And of course, this became impossible. And then we had the awful situation where, for example, in the context of extractive and land and indigenous people's rights, for example, in Peru, defenders told me about the impact of the government ordering restrictions on their movement, but doing nothing to halt illegal encroachment on their territories by loggers. And I could go on and on. There's the overcrowded prisons where people are more at risk. And in many countries, ordinary decent criminals, as sometimes is said, were released because of COVID. But human rights defenders were invariably excluded, we saw it. We see it now in Iran and in Bahrain and in Burundi, and because long-term cases of human rights defenders are a priority for me. So I'm trying to keep an eye on people who've been given very long sentences. So anyway, I better stop there.
Speaking about some of the measures introduced, it has often appeared apparent to us that some governments, and off the top of my head I'm thinking Orban's Hungary or Kaczynski in Poland, had been prepared to use the COVID and the measures to further their political agenda and to further restrict human rights. Have you seen any evidence of this, particularly when it comes to human rights defenders? Have authoritarian or less democratic regimes been more inclined to repress HRDs in a time of global crisis?
Well, it's not for me to say that that is a fact. However, it does appear that governments who are hostile to human rights defenders, authoritarian governments, governments who have a pattern and a history of attacking human rights defenders and calling them all sorts of things, like in the Philippines, communists and terrorists, and in other countries, political activists, and smearing them or whatever. Like in the case of Ruth Mumby, that was death threats from the police. And it does appear that it was a very useful shield, I suppose, for them to be able to use the public health position and needing to try and stop the spread of the virus to target human rights defenders even more. So I suppose, that's the way I would look at it. I haven't done an analysis on why, but from looking at the way that hostile governments target human rights defenders, it certainly was exacerbated during the pandemic, where we saw many human rights defenders being more at risk because of the pandemic, and it seemed to be a deliberate policy of the government.
So another unfortunate trend to have emerged from this crisis has been that marginalized and discriminated communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. How has this impacted the work of HRDs from these communities, including women human rights defenders, LGBTI and other minority groups?
Yeah, well, Deaf and Sorry's recently released a report on the situation of women human rights defenders in Central America and Mexico in the pandemic, and they gathered information from women human rights defenders all over the region, and the consensus was that the conditions for defending human rights had worsened since the arrival of the virus. They saw that attacks against women had increased during the pandemic, and that new strategies had been adopted by states to repress them. Now, we know already that women human rights defenders and LGBTI human rights defenders and Indigenous people's rights defenders, they're already discriminated against, and they're targeted not only for what they do but who they are, and that gives rise to particular vulnerabilities. And then you have the whole economic inequalities that have accentuated the pandemic. So it's been very precarious for defenders to continue with their human rights work. And as well as that, we see, particularly with women, that a lot of them have moved into, trying to provide for the community. During the pandemic, trying to shift a bit of their work into humanitarian work. So the awful case of Zara Alvarez in the Philippines, she was shot dead in August, and prior to that she had received a threatening SMS telling her she had to stop distributing food to members of her community that were very impoverished by COVID. So even when it's just an act of solidarity like that, it's clear that human rights defenders continue to be targeted, women human rights defenders and LGBTI human rights defenders. And I have spoken to, and then there's there's a move towards some legislation using the pandemic as an excuse as well to further target, for example, LGBTI defenders.
Now, aside from COVID, the year has also produced some really powerful human rights stories, for better or for worse. From the pro-democracy movement in Belarus to the tragic passing of political prisoner Amijan Askarov in Kyrgyzstan. It's an issue I know you've been really vocal about, and we've covered quite heavily here at Civil Rights Defenders as well. What has been your human rights story of the year, and why?
Well, the most tragic for me was the death of Azimjan, and I really think you should call him a human rights defender and not a political prisoner, because that just feeds into the narrative of governments. We have to make it clear to governments who is a human rights defender and who isn't. And that's part of what I'm hoping to do during the course of the mandate. And I've spoken to many ambassadors, well, not many, but some ambassadors so far. And I just tell them I know the difference between a human rights defender and a political activist, because very often they try and tell you that mostly they try and tell you whoever it was wasn't a human rights defender. But in Azimjan's case, it hurt me very deeply, because I had visited him in prison. I knew him, and I had worked when I was director of Frontline over the years, and we had got our foreign minister, once he stepped down, Eamon Gilmore, he's now the EU person on human rights, to go and visit him as well. And I had made, since I took up in May, I had issued, I'd done communications on him, I had been in touch with him, and I've done loads of interviews around in Kyrgyzstan, and I just felt I had failed. That's the way I felt. I felt that personally I had failed. Now, I know everybody was working on him, and it wouldn't have been me just that was making any kind of difference if there was a difference to be made. But I felt that I had failed him. The only thing that I do think that I was able to do was to help make sure that his body was brought back to his family in Uzbekistan. But that was the hardest thing for me so far, and because it was a personal connection. The other, in terms of the human rights stories of the year, well, a personal moment for me was the 9th Human Rights Defenders Days. When I retired from Frontline Defenders, I wanted to organise a physical memorial to human rights defenders who have been killed. And my next report my first report to the Council will be on killings. So I fundraised, and I worked with this super firm in Dublin that did the Design for Nothing. And finally, 3 years later, after many ups and downs, we have this beautiful memorial to all human rights defenders who've been killed. And it is based on these Irish Ogham stones, which were used as markers for important occasions like births or deaths in Ireland. They're very ancient. And it's in the back garden of the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is really with an entrance from the gardens that that bound the back garden of the Department of Foreign Affairs. So for me, it's great because, first of all, there's a physical representation there, which is a reminder and a celebration of their life and their courage. But also, the public can go in, but Foreign Affairs will also have a gate. So if they're having receptions or something, the people at the reception can go in. But above all, it's a constant reminder. And the minister said this at the launch. He said it's a constant reminder of the priority of human rights defenders, and should be for now and going forward for the Irish government. So that was a personal moment.
The past few years have seen Europe, which until now was widely regarded as a safe space for HRDs, backslide, both in terms of the respect for human rights and the rule of law, and therefore the protection they could enjoy. How would you describe the challenges for HRDs working across the continent today, and what message or what does this lack of a role model say to those working in more repressive regimes?
Well, I think first of all, it's a very dangerous thing because I have had ambassadors on in the permanent missions, basically saying to me, "Well, look at Europe," and it really is, more or less, don't be giving out to us. Europe isn't that good. So I think we have to challenge, and I say there's no such thing as a good country because there isn't. I think there's a notion that we have to challenge, and that is that human rights defenders are not at risk within Europe or within the European Union. I've dealt with several cases of defenders at risk in the region and who are being harassed offline and online. In some places, they're being criminalized for defending rights, and there have been cases of death threats. And for example, if you look at what's happening to migrant rights defenders in Italy, I mean, when this all started, I thought it was so appalling that people would be criminalized or would be targeted because of their solidarity work with very vulnerable people. And if you look at, for example, in Italy, Carola Rackete and the Juventa 10, there it's just criminalisation of solidarity. And similar things have been going on around the borders of Europe for a long time. And it's a major challenge and seriously undermines the more positive steps that the EU has taken collectively to promote the work of human rights defenders. The other thing that is happening, with the Justice Commissioner announcing that he's going to bring in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence for companies. I think that's very important, but there should be provisions for the protection of human rights defenders within any legislation on this. So we need to start having a conversation about that as well. Like the killing of Daphne Caruana in Malta some years ago is also, it was a real shock to people that something like this could happen. Well, I started this work in the 70s, so I take a very long view. And when I started, there were all these dictatorships and authoritarian governments right across Latin America and parts of Africa. And there was, of course, the Soviet Union. And bit by bit, the people always continued. I mean, that is the extraordinary thing about people. They find the smallest little. I can remember in Charter 77, they went out in the streets with photocopied charters for people to sign. In Tibet, they printed out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to try and educate people. So I think and you look at Latin America now, there's still an awful lot of terrible things happening, particularly to human rights defenders, killings, as I said, and women human rights defenders in a patriarchal society are targeted so much more. And but at the same time, they have democracies with a small d, and that's different. And you don't have the taking the bodies into the planes and dropping them, murdering them and dropping them over into the lake or the sea or anything like that anymore. So really what I'm saying is that I think there will always, the world seems to, in my view, the world seems to go up and down. Governments go up and down. And there are good governments. When I say good, I don't actually believe any government is really good because everyone has their own political and strategic interests and will compromise on human rights to suit their interests. But at the same time, I do think that there is there's a chance. I think that a lot of them learned from Trump. I mean, I do think, the populist movement clearly was a reaction, but there was also a lot of, it was like they were feeding off each other. It's a bit like the way legislation spread around the various countries to restrict the work of human rights defenders. They learned that from one another too, I think. And it was about testing how much they could get away with. And with, as you say, in Poland and Hungary, for example, it's a really difficult situation for human rights defenders. And but I'm hoping that there may be a bit more of a swing with the election of Joe Biden and a move again towards multilateral, I suppose, advocacy and multilateral engagement, that some of those people who were trying, like in Brazil, to really it's all to do with power and economics and political power, will be reined in a bit, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So I don't know. It's very difficult. There's no doubt it's very difficult, but it's always been very difficult. It just has different shades of difficulty in any decade.
As we mentioned, you took up your mandate as UN Special Rapporteur for HRDs at the onset of a global crisis, so not really much of an opportunity to really think ahead and set an agenda of your own. But I was wondering, looking ahead, looking towards a post-COVID world, if we are to ever get there, what would be the key priorities of your office and your term?
To be honest, I am just focusing on human rights defenders because I see this as I'm only going to be in the office a short time. I'm not going to be able to deal with systemic stuff. I think that is the job of NGOs and international organizations on the ground who are best placed to create momentum to bring about change. But what I will do is I will come at it from a people-centered approach, which means I'm just going to try and protect insofar as I can. And remember, I'm just like everyone else. I'm one voice. I see myself as a bridge between human rights defenders and governments. And I think the added value, having come from an NGO, I think the added value is that governments are generally going to hopefully listen, at least meet me. So far, anyone I've asked for a meeting with has met me. It doesn't mean that they agree with me, but it's like inch by inch, you just try and communicate the unfairness and the injustice of targeting human rights defenders. So my priorities, as I said, was killings, first of all, because since 2015, OHCHR has documented the killings of human rights defenders in 64 countries. And that, I think, is a shocking statistic, that almost a third of the member states of the UN, in almost a third, one defender at least has been killed. We all know about the countries where most defenders are killed, like Colombia, Philippines, Latin America generally. But so killings, and so as well as that, looking at a bit at killings as where threats have occurred ahead of time. Because in some killings there has been a pattern of threats or a history of threats. A pattern is the wrong word. History of threat. So, like in the case of that Philippine woman, Zara Alvarez, she was threatened in 2019. She was threatened in 2020. Again, the Mama Fikile, who was killed in South Africa about 2 months ago, she had threatening phone calls before she was killed. So looking at how threats can escalate and set up the climate for human rights defenders to be killed as well. So then, getting back to the most marginalised, as you pointed out, women human rights defenders, LGBTI human rights defenders, and environmental human rights defenders. And I also want to look at defenders who are children. Because I think this is a growing. I was on I think it was a Human Rights Day party the other day with young activists, and it was very interesting for me to hear what they were doing. A lot of them are getting involved very much in climate justice, and not only that, but you often see, for example, Indigenous children who advocate for their right to be educated in their own language being targeted, that kind of thing. Also to try and work a bit on defenders with disabilities and those defending migrant and refugee rights. And then long-term cases, people who've been in prison for very long periods, like Abdelhadi Al-Khawaja, my ex-colleague who's a life sentence in Bahrain, Jermaine Makuki in Burundi, several in Iran, several women like Atina Diani, Nasrin, of course, has been put back into prison, and so that's really, and then of course business and financial institutions, because it's in the context of these mega projects that so many attacks take place.
What about international mechanisms for the protection of human rights defenders? Do you have a view of how or if we can make them more effective?
Well, I think Hina Jalani always said, and I have great respect for her, unwavering respect. She said, you have to remember that it is government's responsibility to protect human rights. And I think you have to take that as the first step, and you have to remind them of their obligations, under the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and also the Universal Declaration and the covenants that give force to it and all that. I think it is wrong to be hoping that international mechanisms will be doing anything. The UN is a very political body, and it's hugely bureaucratic, and it is tied up in rules and procedures. And from my point of view, just getting a communication out takes so long between the procedures that are in place, the clearance that needs to be done, all of this. So there's 600 human rights defenders sitting in the inbox in my mandate inbox. And there isn't a hope in hell that I'll be able to get to do communications on them all. There's one person doing communications in the office. So I have to grade them by the most serious, which is terrible. But that's the only way it is possible to work. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, and I am not skilled at how international mechanisms could be strengthened, or whether or not there are other things that could be done to improve the situation of human rights defenders institutionally. I really don't know is the answer. But I do think NGOs, there's a huge job of human rights education to be done on the ground in countries where there are where human rights defenders are targeted. And I think this is really important because, if society, if there is an acceptance by society of the work of human rights defenders, and for example, we're talking here, for just as an example, women human rights defenders and LGBTI defenders, it will help push those governments into taking more positive action. But to rely on the UN or any of the special procedures, like we're just another channel. We don't have any more power than an NGO. Yeah, don't make that mistake.
As a final question, and I noted your illustrious career at the beginning of this episode, I was curious, having reached the highest international level for HRD protection, reflecting over the years, reflecting upon the young activist entering the world of human rights some 4 decades ago, I guess. What do you see now that you perhaps didn't see then? And I guess what I'm asking is, what message do you have sitting where you are for human rights defenders or up-and-coming human rights defenders looking at this field and the everyday challenges and threats that it could potentially bring, but also feeling the satisfaction and the fulfillment of making this world a better place?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started, as you said, a very long time ago, and it was mainly civil and political rights then within Amnesty International at the time. And so then that work evolved. It was actually just coming in when I left Amnesty in 2000 to set up Frontline Defenders. But I set up Frontline Defenders because I really wanted to concentrate on human rights defenders at risk and try and offer some sort of fast, flexible response. Because Amnesty International was a big organisation. It had a whole load of different, fair trials, death penalty, prisoners of conscience, everything. And there wasn't really a very specific, at that time, program for human rights defenders at risk. So I wanted to just concentrate all my energy on that. So that's what I did. And gradually and then we learned in Frontline, we learned from human rights defenders themselves, as you do in civil rights defenders, about what was needed and tried to put in place the things that they said they need. It was led by the defenders themselves. So in terms of, so nowadays, obviously it's not just civil and political rights, it's economic, social and cultural rights. It's also much more based on minorities. Like, nobody would have talked about LGBTI defenders when I was starting off, even within Amnesty. So there's a better understanding of the range of who is a human rights defender and the work they do, I think. Genuinely, I think that. And of course, the internet and digital campaigning and digital communication has been a great boon, as well as being a negative for smearing people online. Like, I always remember early on in Frontline, Justina Mokoko in Zimbabwe was disappeared, and normally if somebody has disappeared, you're trying to get in touch with the lawyers and you're trying to see is there any news, and you're trying to do this, that and the other, and get the right contacts in the government and blah, blah, blah. And they're busy. They're trying to do their work, and they don't want all these international organizations harassing them about, what's anything. They created a Facebook page, and every couple of days they stuck up if there was any news or anything different or possibilities for action. And I thought it was so brilliant that we could any of us who were involved in the case, could just log on and be able to find this information and work in it. And as it happened, in a weak moment, the Zimbabwean Minister for the Interior gave me his mobile number at the Africa Human Rights Commission. So I was able to be ringing him all the time. So anyway, so what I'm saying is that the use of technology has also helped as well as harmed human rights defenders, and we shouldn't forget that bit of it. And finally, I think if I was to say, I just say you just have to keep at it. You just have to be persistent. I mean, you don't see results quickly. But it's not all human rights defenders only need little victories. They only need a small little victory to keep them going. And the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I remember listening to him outside my house before I went into an Amnesty meeting at one stage. And he said it was his birthday, and he was asked, what did he think he was there for? And he said, I think we're here to make the world a bit more civilized. And now, obviously, that's a very Western concept, but you know what he meant. He meant just, and he meant that we improve things for other people. And I think that's what human rights defenders are doing, and anyone who is working in human rights. And I would just say, you're doing the right thing. Just persist and keep persisting.
Mary, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and on behalf of everyone at Civil Rights Defenders, we truly wish you all the best in your mandate and hope our paths cross again soon. For listeners, thank you also for tuning in, and just a quick reminder that you can follow all our episodes via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, CRD's website, and as of this month on YouTube too. Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks a million.